Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's seminar organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I would also like to extend my welcome to those who have joined us online over live stream. Today's seminar is titled Non-Alignment's Long Shadow, India and the War in Ukraine. And our guest speaker for today is Dr. Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Today's event is chaired by Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow here at ISAS. I will now hand over the session to him.
Great, thank you so much, Syed. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ISAS. It's my great pleasure to welcome Rohan Mukherjee to ISAS. Rohan is no stranger to Singapore or NUS. He was an assistant professor at Yale NUS for several years before moving to London, where he's now assistant professor at the LSE. And he's been here at ISAS for the last couple of weeks as an academic visitor, and his stint ends today, I believe. Today, Rohan is going to cap his visit off here by giving us a talk on India's attitudes towards the war in Ukraine that has received considerable policy, scholarly, and public attention. The plan today is to talk about, for Rohan to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we'll open it up for a discussion with you. With that, Rohan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Karthik. I hope the mic is fine. Everyone can hear me. Thank you very much, Karthik. I'm also very grateful to ISAS for having me as an academic visitor for the last couple of years, a couple of weeks, God. And to Iqbal, director, who couldn't be here today. So what I'm going to do is, again, I apologize to those of you who attended my talk last week at RSIS. There's a lot of overlap because I think India is obviously part of the global south. That talk was on the global south and the war. This is much more focused on India. But I do want to start by situating India's response to the war in Ukraine within the broader global south response. Then I want to talk about a relatively underappreciated aspect of India's approach to the war and to international order writ large. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about my book, which came out last year, which looks historically at rising powers and their desire for status or membership of the great power club that manages the international order. And then I will conclude with some implications for the current international order and broader insights that might be relevant to diplomacy and international relations. So I'll just get into it. So the economic fallout of the war has been on the top of everyone's minds, and so has the response of different countries. So this was a graphic that was published by the New York Times in October 2022, and it basically looks at the value of average monthly goods traded with Russia in March to October 2022 compared to the same metric in the period between 2017 and 2021. And we all know that the West particularly, and by that I mean the US, the European Union, the UK, but also Japan and South Korea, have sort of placed sanctions on Russia, and Singapore has also joined in those sanctions. But many countries have continued to trade with Russia after the invasion. And so on the left, we see this massive increase in the value of exports from Russia to countries such as China, Turkey, and India. And on the right, we see a contraction of exports, of imports to Russia, or imports from these countries to Russia, with a substantial increase for countries like China and Turkey. In India's case, the highlighted bits, exports from Russia have dramatically increased while imports to Russia have contracted a bit. And in a sense, this shows the opportunistic buying of Russian energy at discounted prices and in response to the anticipated supply shocks of the war, created by the war. A lot of the exports from Russia are commodities, so specifically oil, natural gas, coal, fertilizers, and so on. And in turn, Russia is importing a wide range of manufactured and intermediate goods required for its economy and the war effort. So this is taking place despite sanctions, because at least in China's case, the trade has shifted to being denominated in yuan instead of dollars. And these images really show how difficult it is to decouple economies overnight, especially in the case of natural resource trade. Even countries imposing sanctions on Russia, like Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany, and Japan, have found it very difficult to turn off the tap overnight. So, for example, the Japanese firm Mitsui remains invested in Russia's Sakhalin 2 natural gas project, because that project alone supplies 9% of Japan's natural gas imports. So despite sanctions, complete economic cutoff is often impossible for countries that are not self-sufficient in energy like the United States has been since 2019. Similarly, European energy trading firms like Gunvor and Vitol have also continued to buy Russian refined oil products, such as petrol and diesel, because those were not covered for a long time by Western sanctions. Now they are covered since February this year, but they continue to remain invested, these companies, despite that G7 cap on crude and refined exports. In other cases, like China and India, there has been more opportunistic ramping up. And I don't mean that in any sort of value-laden sense. It is just seeing an opportunity and taking it. So an opportunistic ramping up of energy imports from Russia, which was forced to sell oil and gas at discounted rates initially due to the sanctions. And this led many countries to buy Russian energy resources at even higher volumes than before the invasion. So the net result was that the value of Russian trade actually increased after the invasion. A lot of this is obviously due to higher global oil prices, which offset the Russian discount on oil. But overall, Russia still has the resources coming in to fund its war effort. And in a sense, this undermines or blunts a little bit the effect of Western sanctions. The difference between the West and other countries is also evident in the realm of diplomacy. So China and Russia declared a no-limits partnership less than a month before the invasion of Ukraine. This statement explicitly linked Russia's opposition to NATO expansion and China's position on Taiwan in opposition to the West. And since the invasion of Ukraine began, China has provided diplomatic cover for Russia in various multilateral forums. The leaders of Brazil and Indonesia have offered peace plans that have been deeply dissatisfying to Ukraine and the West. President Lula, for example, has stated on various occasions that Russia and Ukraine, backed by the West, Ukraine being backed by the West, are both to blame for the war and its continuation. So one version of his peace plan would require Ukraine to cede Crimea to Russia. Meanwhile, Indonesia's Defense Minister Prabowo, who's pictured here at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year in Singapore, called for freezing of the territorial status quo and creating demilitarized zones monitored by UN peacekeepers with a UN referendum in the Donbas territories held by Russia. So both these plans would essentially require Ukraine to give up territory and are therefore unacceptable to Ukraine. Whether the plans are serious or not, they signal a growing weariness, I would argue, with the war in the global South and a desire to bring about peace within a reasonable time frame. Finally, there are reports that Egypt considered selling arms to Russia, but decided against it due to US pressure, and South Africa provided arms shipments, or at least an arms shipment to Moscow. And finally, India, India's political leadership has consistently argued that the West is being hypocritical in its insistence on globally coordinated action against Russia, when the West has rarely acted decisively to solve conflicts in the global South, and in fact has made them worse through its involvement at various points. So Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar famously said in June last year that Europe has to grow out of the mindset that its problems are the world's problems. Right? And this sort of echoed around a lot of different think tank and academic circles. Taken together, so it would appear that many countries in the global South are actually acting quite independently and out of line with Western positions on the war. The UN General Assembly offers another lens through which we can see this. So this table lists the 6 resolutions brought against Russia at the UNGA since the invasion. The most recent one was in February 2023, just before the 1-year anniversary of the invasion. And you see in the extreme right-hand column, we can see that 4 of the 6 resolutions enjoyed about the support of about 2/3 of the membership of the UN. And these are the ones that emphasize the violation of the UN Charter and call on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. And also the resolution that invalidated the referendums held in Russian-held parts of Ukraine. The resolution that gets less than majority support are the ones suspending Russia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council and calling on Russia to pay war reparations to Ukraine. So one can imagine that these last two resolutions that got less support had more bite. And so, than the ones that simply called on Russia to withdraw. So Moscow would have put greater effort into blocking them by lobbying other countries. It's also the case that many countries didn't vote for these 2 resolutions are themselves autocratic countries and are probably worried about setting a precedent where another autocracy is punished in material terms by the powerful group of democracies that are organizing the diplomatic and economic effort against Russia globally. So this map shows how countries voted in these 6 resolutions. The countries in orange either abstained or did not vote on all 6 resolutions. In other words, they never voted for any resolutions against Russia. The countries in green always voted for resolutions against Russia, so they voted with Ukraine. And the countries in red always voted with Russia. So there are only 3 countries in that category: Belarus, Syria, and North Korea. And the rest of the countries, mostly the ones in gray, did a combination of voting in favor of some resolutions and abstaining or not voting on others. So the green countries are basically the West and their allies, plus a few countries like Myanmar and Papua New Guinea, which have idiosyncratic reasons as to why they're voting in that way. And we can think of the orange countries, and that's really what I'm also quite interested in, as firmly committed to not taking a position on this issue. It's clear all of them are in what we would call the global south, and most of them are in Africa and Asia. So what explains their position? This is a list of the top 10 importers of Russian defense equipment from 2017 to 2021. This is the same pre-invasion time period used by the New York Times in their economic analysis, so I use the same period. And the second column shows Russia's share in each country's arms imports. And the third column shows how these countries voted in the 6 UNGA resolutions. And it becomes clear that those who have historically depended on Russia for arms imports were much more likely to consistently not vote against Russia at the UN. Right? The exceptions are Egypt and Iraq, where the US has diplomatic leverage to sway the outcome in a more Western-friendly direction, let's say. Right? So defense clearly plays a role. It's also relevant in India's case. This pie chart shows the cumulative shares of different supplier countries in India's arms imports from the end of the Cold War until 2021, the year before Russia invaded Ukraine. Right? We can see that Russia accounts for 61% of India's defense imports in this period. And defense imports have long-term implications for bilateral relations due to the ongoing need for spare parts, maintenance, and other supplies connected to the equipment that is being imported. And it also affects military training, doctrine, and so on, because you work with what you have in a sense, and the nature of the equipment that you receive. And all of this makes it very difficult to change defense relationships overnight, or even within any reasonable time frame. Right? It could take decades. And naturally, this plays a role in how India calculated its self-interest in not condemning or sanctioning Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. But the cumulative picture doesn't tell the full story. Right? There are a number of reasons why India's so-called dependence, as many people have characterized it, on Russian arms is a bit misleading when we think of India's approach to the war. So I guess before I get into this, I would say, first of all, I think the reason it might be misleading is because India is not expected to sanction Russia. That would truly be economic self-harm when vast numbers of Indian citizens need access to fuel, fertilizer, and other commodities that Russia produces. But there is a range of other actions that India could have taken to publicly signal that it disapproves of Russia's actions and would prefer a restoration of the status quo, if not an actual improvement in Russia-Ukraine relations. And symbolic voting at the UN would be an example of such an action, right? So such lower order actions are possible because the cumulative picture does not show recent trends, right? So the annual share of India's arms imports for the same post-Cold War period, 1990 to 2021, shown in this graph, shows that around 2002, India has been diversifying its arms imports away from Russia and towards the West. And during this period, Russia's share of India's annual imports has fallen from almost 90% to 35% on an annual basis, while the share of the United States and its allies, by which I include, when I calculated this, I included NATO members, Israel and South Korea, has risen from less than 10% to 65%. Right? The diversification is particularly pronounced and steady after 2012. So for a decade before the war, India was already changing the mix of its defense imports, a fact that I would argue mitigates some of the dependence claims, at least when it comes to lower order actions like UN voting or public statements, right? So India's room of action becomes even clearer when we look at India's share of Russian arms exports. So how much India buys from Russia as a percentage of Russia's total arms exports. In the 10 years before the invasion, India accounted for 1/3 of Russia's arms market, well ahead of the next country, China, at 14%. Right? So it's hard to imagine that being Russia's largest arms buyer gives India no leverage in a situation where India might want to signal its disapproval and support the international order against Russia's actions. Of course, one might argue that India is itself going through a military crisis at the moment with China on the Ladakh border, and therefore can't afford to alienate its largest arms supplier. But if there's anything the war has shown, it is that Russian-made weapons are less effective on the battlefield when facing a technologically advanced adversary, and that Russia is not in a position to continue supplying its major defense partners in the way that it used to, because it needs its own material for the war. Moreover, I would argue the US and its allies would undoubtedly assist India with military supplies in the event of a larger crisis involving China. So India's strong relationship with these countries is itself a result of fairly agile diplomacy over the last 2 decades. And it seems unreasonable to think that it would not pay off in a time of crisis with China, which is really the main goal of these partnerships that India has struck with the US and other countries and its allies. So all this is not to argue that India should condemn Russia or should rely on Western defense imports, but to show that India can say and do these things that run contrary to Russian interests if India wants to, right? But India chooses not to. That's what I want to emphasize, for reasons that go beyond economic and security relationships. So this is really kind of what I'm trying to show here, is that this security defense dependence is not an overriding thing per se. There is room for calibrated actions if India wanted to actually signal disapproval. And we can see this if we once again look at the broader geopolitical context. So there is something about being a global South country that itself creates a tendency to have mixed feelings about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is a map of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. It has expanded since then, but the point I want to make is that historical tendencies growing out of decolonization and third world solidarity have to be accounted for to understand the global response to the Ukraine war. So other countries have joined the non-aligned movement since the end of the Cold War, but this is, I'm looking at the historical membership during the Cold War, right? And this becomes clear when we look at the same members of the non-aligned movement and how they voted in the 6 resolutions against Russia. Only a handful of countries in this group, mostly in Latin America, have been firmly with Ukraine at the UN. These are shown in green, as before. And the countries in red have either consistently voted with Russia or consistently abstained or not voted. Right? And the countries in orange adopted some mix of voting, which is that they voted against Russia on some resolutions and abstained or did not vote on others. So if you think from that first map as green representing the West and its allies, the West has very few allies among countries that have historically sought to develop a third way in international politics that does not play into great power politics. Now, one might argue that the UN votes reflect all kinds of considerations that don't have much to do with history, identity, and ideology. Smaller countries often vote blindly to follow a regional line, or they vote based on the preferences of the individual who is their permanent representative at the UN. All this is true for regular UN voting, but given the sheer global importance of this issue and the efforts made by the West and Russia to sort of sway the vote to lobby governments to their own side, it's fairly safe to bet that countries were thinking carefully about how they were voting. And even if they were voting along regional lines or on the preferences of their diplomats, the choice of vote still tells us something important about the disconnect between the West and the global South, particularly when we're not looking at just one resolution, but all 6, right? This is data for all 6 resolutions. So it's not a one-off thing. This is a pattern in some sense. And this disconnect is further confirmed by public opinion data. So this is a survey conducted by YouGov and Cambridge University in October 2022 across different countries. It's a large survey, and so this is a selection of the relevant questions. And they asked various questions about the war and the causes and so on. And when you look at the first question, which suggests that ethnic Russians in Ukraine were subjected to genocide before the war, and people asked whether it's true or false, you can see that across the West, there's a fairly consistent rejection of that claim, but it's really almost the opposite in the global South or the non-West, right? The much larger proportions of respondents in Brazil, Egypt, India, and Indonesia, and Nigeria think that this is true. The same applies to questions about Nazis influencing the Ukraine government. The numbers are almost flipped between the West and non-West, although larger percentage of people in the global South say they don't know, which is also totally fair. The difference is even starker on the question of Western governments establishing military infrastructure in Ukraine to bully and threaten Russia, right? As well as who is to blame for the war. There are, again, many don't knows in the global South, but much higher proportions say the West. And in India in particular, 42% of respondents thought Russians were subjected to genocide in Ukraine. People of Russian descent, that is, a Russian ethnicity. 46% thought the Ukraine government is under the influence of Nazis. 57% thought the West was using Ukraine to bully Russia, and they were evenly split between the West and Russia on who is to blame for the war, almost evenly split. Right? Some of this could be the result of disinformation campaigns, there's no denying that, but I'd argue that an audience also has to be receptive to disinformation for it to actually work. What we often find is that disinformation reinforces prior prejudices, right? So this is established fact or finding in the literature. And so in a sense, very few people's minds are actually changed by what they consume. It just reinforces prior ideas. So all this points to us to the fact that while economic and defense relationships are important, we have to also think about the role of ideas and ideology. While the West may have won the Cold War in material terms, we can see now that the end of history was obviously not a defining ideological moment. There's still a substantial portion of the world, especially in the global South, that is deeply skeptical of what is essentially a Western international order. Many of them see Russia as part of that order, and therefore see the Ukraine conflict as primarily an intra-Western or European conflict in which they wish to have no involvement. This is important to note that the countries that abstain are unlikely to strongly endorse Russia's actions, but they're also not willing to strongly condemn Russia's actions. And their ideal position is to dissociate from a European conflict as much as possible. So non-alignment in this sense is both strategically useful and is also a philosophical framework for thinking about the world for these countries. And of course, the global South remembers that the West has rarely been interested in conflicts in Asia and Africa unless it was for self-interested reasons. Therefore, they see no reason to be morally compelled to be interested in this conflict, except for their own interests. There's also, I would argue, a legacy of Soviet relations in the global South, or what used to be called the Third World, where the Soviet Union essentially invested in sort of big ticket infrastructural projects. We see this with China as well today. But back then it was, dams, roads, scientific establishments, so on, whereas the US largely focused on civil society, things that would improve democracy, education, the Peace Corps, Ford Foundation, those kinds of things, right? Grants and so on. So this creates a somewhat, sentimental attachment in many parts of the global South to the Soviet legacy of friendship. You see this even in some of the informal comments that folks make in India about the relationship, the history of friendship between the Soviets and the Indians. More broadly, I'd argue the West, because it dominates the international order, and the rest have sort of acquiesced until now. Many of the rest, though, are now in positions where they can actually influence regional or global outcomes. I'm thinking of China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, and other large countries. And these countries no longer want to acquiesce in that order that is not of their making. They want a say in the making of order itself. And so this is a good place to talk about India as a rising power. India, as I already mentioned, has continued trading with Russia, has refused to vote against Russia at the UN, and has also participated in some defense cooperation. There were military drills as recently as September 2022, the Vostok drills where India and China took part. So this raises a sort of broader question. As a country that seeks to play a greater role in the international order, why does India not condemn or sanction a gross violation of the fundamental principles of order, such as sovereignty, territorial integrity, and self-determination? The war creates also global instability, high inflation, especially for essential commodities that many Indians rely on. It creates supply chain problems, and it also weakens the general agreement among countries that state sovereignty should not be violated through open invasion. Now, of course, this has happened before. The war in Iraq is an example, but one might argue that even though it's happened before, each new violation further weakens that norm, and it should be taken very seriously. So why then does India not do more to protect the international order that has benefited India so much? That's the sort of an important question, and is a class of questions that I address in my book, which came out last year, on rising powers and international order. And essentially it asks sort of why rising powers often undermine an international order that has enabled their rise. Because by definition, they are doing better than everyone else. In relative terms, they are growing powerful, they have time, they can wait to become more powerful before pursuing their interests, but they start to sort of challenge an order or try to undermine it quite early in their rise. So why change what is working so well? And at other times, we see rising powers accepting certain arrangements in an international order that constrains their rise. And famous example of this is China in the sort of CTBT negotiations, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty negotiations in the early 90s, where China, after sort of putting a lot of obstacles in the way of the treaty, eventually accepted it, even though, and actually removed all their, most of their opposition, even though it would affect the development of their nuclear program, which was far behind the Americans, right? It happened in the end that the Americans couldn't ratify the treaty and it never came into force. But the fact that China made a number of concessions is an important thing. We see this in other instances as well throughout history. And so the question then is why, these puzzles become hard to answer from a purely material standpoint, so purely security and economic standpoint. because if an order is producing substantial positive economic and security benefits, it should be supported. That's the logical position. If it is taking away from those benefits, it should be opposed. But rising powers often do exactly the opposite in these situations. So the book's argument rests on the premise that material goods are not the only thing that states care about. They also care about things like status or having a position of eminence in a hierarchy. And the international order is, if anything, a hierarchy. And the great powers form an exclusive club that manage this hierarchy. You can think of the Concert of Europe in the 19th century. You can think of the Executive Council of the League of Nations in the interwar period. You can think of the P5 in the current international order. The international order is not democratic, it is oligarchic, right? And the great powers manage this order through international institutions. So in our current system, that is the United Nations, the WTO, the NPT, climate change framework, and so on. And rising powers, as they grow, they develop greater self-confidence and seek recognition of their growing importance in this order. What this means is they seek membership of the Great Power Club as symbolic equals of the great powers. And so even though they are less powerful, they seek an order that should give them the same privileges as it gives the great powers. But institutions are often designed to preserve the privileges of those who built them. So this creates problems for accommodating rising powers in an international order. And so if these institutions, I find at least, are able to create that status equality for the rising power, they are much more likely to support the institutions. But if there's inequality, rising power is more likely to try and undermine that institution by trying to delegitimate it or setting up new institutions or just breaking the rules. And so the bottom line in a sense is that a rising power will not make sacrifices to support an order that does not treat it as an equal of the great power club. So the book has 3 case studies. I'm not going to belabor them here. Just to point out that this is a historically consistent phenomenon. I look at 3 different international orders from 1815 onwards. I can talk about why 1815 in the Q&A. And I look at these central institutions, which are mostly focused on security within each order. And I look at one rising power over time. So the United States in the 19th century, Japan in the interwar period, and India during the Cold War. And I find similar patterns, right? That when they are given that equality, these countries are much more supportive of international arrangements. When they're not, they try to reform them or break them up entirely. And the case of the US is important because it also punctures that myth of US exceptionalism as not being of this type. Status seeking is actually not just a non-Western phenomenon, as many people talk about it, because now we talk about it mostly with regard to China. But it is actually a historically recurring phenomenon where the US is also subject to similar pressures. So in today's order, we see similar patterns with regard to India. India has benefited immensely from the international order. The WTO and free trade have made India much wealthier. International financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have provided India with easy development finance. India is the largest borrower from the World Bank historically, by far. The NPT has prevented the widespread, the spread of nuclear weapons in the system. And the UN Security Council has broadly, with a few glaring failures like Rwanda and Syria, done a not terrible job of managing international peace despite these omissions, right? Through peacekeeping and other means. But as rising powers rise, they seek that status, they seek representation, or that is at least the way India has articulated its desire. And India has consistently complained about not being given its due in the international system. India seeks reformed multilateralism, to use the words of many Indian prime ministers and leaders, but also currently that is the watchword of the Modi government. And even something like the BRICS is really about having a greater say in global governance. So it's not so much that India has an alternative normative vision of what order should look like. India likes the current order because it works for India, but it would like to be treated as an equal of the West and be a member of the high table that runs the order. But the West doesn't include India as an equal. From India's perspective, the order is essentially run by an exclusive club of Western countries that don't want newcomers to break in. And that's fairly evident when you look at the various institutional critiques that India has of the international order. I mean, if you even look at the United Nations and its staffing, so there's a great paper by Courtney Fung and Xinghong Lam in 2021, where they collected data on chief executive and senior management positions since 1971, the year that China joined the UN. And you see that those positions are dominated historically by the US, France, UK, Japan, and Canada, right? China and Russia are way down the list. So there is this difference between the P3, the members, US, Japan, US, Britain, and France in the Security Council, and Japan and Russia. I keep saying Japan, Russia and China India is not even in the top decile of countries in terms of leadership positions in the UN. It's very much still an outsider when it comes to the great power club. China is at least a partial insider because it's a permanent member of the Security Council. It is an official nuclear weapon state in the NPT and so on. India is none of these things, right? So India has protested the inequalities of these institutions. It focuses on voting rights at the World Bank and the IMF. Despite being the largest recipient of World Bank aid, India still is dissatisfied with the World Bank. This goes against the standard understanding of regimes in the international system, where essentially if they're producing positive benefits, countries should stay within them. That's the sort of Robert Keohane view of international regimes. Why then is India dissatisfied with current regimes when they have produced so much economic benefit for India, at least in the realm of IFIs? And the answer is, of course, that they want greater status. They want voting rights that recognize their growing economic power and eminence. The same goes for climate change negotiations. India agrees on the need to mitigate and adapt for climate change, but it disagrees with the principle on which the emissions are calculated, arguing that there should be historical recognition for the role of global North countries in creating the problem. In human rights as well, there's this a divide between the sort of West and non-West here. The non-West one can include non-democracies like China, but also non-Western illiberal democracies or non-liberal democracies like India, by which I mean India is democratic in that it has free and fair elections, but it doesn't hew to the Western ideal of liberal democracy, which is a very specific thing. And so these countries will never be in the inner circle of that order that is run and managed by Western liberal democracies. Law of the sea, similar dynamics. When, of course, we all talk about China and its violations of UNCLOS, but China's response often is that, the US can talk about UNCLOS when it signs UNCLOS, right? The US has never actually signed the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. A couple of years ago, when in the Indian case, there was a freedom of navigation operation done by the American Navy in Indian waters, India's online Twitter sphere went bonkers, right? They were really upset that how dare the Indian Navy come into our waters, and how dare the American Navy come into our waters and violate our space, right? And so, there is a sense in which the charge of hypocrisy is very strong. And of course, there's the issue of UN Security Council membership and the NPT, which India has historically criticized as an unequal discriminatory treaty for the longest time. So what are the implications then, right? India will not defend an order over which it feels little ownership because it does not grant India the eminence that its leaders think it deserves. In this regard, I think India shares with Russia and China a sense of being outside the inner circle to varying extents of this order. And this is why Indian leaders have frequently articulated the desire for a multipolar global order, and especially in summits of the Russia, India, China trilateral. They actually have a trilateral, which India joined even at the height of border tensions with China, right? In summer of 2020, and then again in 2021 virtually. Sorry, someone's phone is making noise. Yeah. So multipolarity is not just about power, but the more equitable distribution of status and legitimate authority in the institutions of the rules-based order. And the Ukraine war, in a sense, offers India an opportunity, both in material terms, but also in status terms, to, in a sense, not follow the West at a critical time, which then puts India in a position of equality with the West in terms of status, gives it more importance among other global South countries that are also looking to be non-aligned in this war, and puts India in a quite unique position. And India is now reaping those benefits because countries are now saying, we admire India's stance on this, right? They have come about and said. Some of that is, of course, also PR by India. A limiting factor in all of this is Russia, right? Which is, to what extent can Russia sustain the war effort? Because if Russia goes too far and collapses internally, that defeats the purpose of having a multipolar world order. So there is, in a sense, a limit to how much India will support Russia in this. It will not aid in the sort of destruction of Russia in that sense internally, because that defeats the whole purpose of India's goals. So India's ideological distance, I'm going to close with a few of these graphs and then we can open it up. The ideological distance from the West in India, or for India, I think is best shown in this graph, which uses ideal point estimation to plot the votes by the US, Russia, and India in the UN General Assembly, every annual session from 1946 to 2020. And essentially, these ideal points provide a way to capture the distance between preferences of voters in a spatial model. And the data they estimate where a country's preferences are on a spectrum, measuring positions towards the US liberal international order. right? So this is, in a sense, using votes to elicit true preferences, and the assumption being that UNGA votes, because they're non-binding, are not as high stakes as Security Council votes, and so can be a reliable proxy for a country's preferences. And as this chart shows, for most of the Cold War, India was non-aligned. Its preferences were roughly in the middle of the preferences of the US and the Soviet Union. But after the Cold War, India's preferences diverged from the US in the 90s before settling back into this middle space, while Russia got much closer to the US preferences in the 90s as it was sorting out the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, and then settled into this middle space close to India. But most importantly, since the end of the Cold War, India has been consistently further from US preferences than Russia. This is very important, right? Because if you only think of India as dependent on Russia, partner of the United States, adversary of China, you forget what India actually wants. And in this regard, India is even less a supporter of the rules-based international order than Russia, right? When you think about it in these terms. So the common preference between India, Russia, and China for multipolarity becomes even more starkly clear when you include China in the picture, right? Aside from the 1980s, when there was some divergence between India and China, their foreign policy preferences with regard to the Western international order have been very similar. They almost track each other after 1996, right? But in addition, you can see that after around 2000, perhaps as a result of the US response to 9/11, the preferences of India, China, and Russia have clustered together for the most part in the UN General Assembly. So the evidence points to the fact that while India's defense relationship with Russia and economic opportunism with regard to oil and gas may play a role in its response to the war in Ukraine, I think it would be a grave mistake to ignore India's view of the international order itself, which is a function of India's exclusion from a US-dominated, Western-dominated global high table. And in this regard, India has more in common with China and Russia than it would like to admit. And you see this consistently in the statements of Indian leaders over time. In the aftermath of major crises, India does not call for protecting the international order. It does not call for doubling down on the principles of liberalism and whatever. It just calls for reforming the order to deal with crises better. And reform means what? Include India, right? So after the invasion of Iraq, late in 2003, Vajpayee is on record as saying, the recent crises suggest that, until the UNSC is reformed, it will not reflect the will of nations. You see that even in the case of the US-India relationship, when Modi visited, while Obama was still president and visited the US and gave a historic speech in both houses of Congress, he also said that the effectiveness of US-India cooperation would increase if institutions framed with the mindset of the 20th century were to reflect the realities of today, right? So India's position is that the current order is based on an outdated principle, which is those who run it won the Second World War. It's time to reflect the differences, the radically different order the radically different international composition that exists today. And finally, the RIC meeting itself of November 2021, where Shankars, the foreign minister of India, said, we believe that a multipolar and rebalanced world based on blah, 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 requires reformed multilateralism, right? So again, you hear the same language coming out of India as that comes out of China and Russia about multipolarity. And then it is a really important thing that I think we should be paying attention to when we think about India's position. So I think we can stop there. I have a slide about implications, but I can discuss that in the Q&A. I can sense Anit Mukherjee falling asleep. So I'm going to stop here and we can open it up to Q&A.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Rohan. That was fantastic. As people gather their thoughts, maybe I can start off with a couple of points, questions, and then we'll open it up. I have 3 points / comments, questions, and I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Sure.
The first is on your argument of ideology, ideology. I'm wondering, so a lot of the commentary that I've read and a lot of the commentary that makes more sense to me on India's positions on Ukraine centers on interests, right? That the war was just not in India's national interest to oppose, to condemn, to make a very public statement on, right? India, as you mentioned, it wants a multipolar international order where it seeks and strives to be one amongst the poles, and it wants to exploit the divisions that exist amongst it to advance its own interests over the long term, right? So how does your argument or can you differentiate your argument from that, from the purely national interests-based argument that you keep hearing more and more. That seems highly plausible, given the state of the international system today, the fact that India does not want China and Russia to get any closer, which would undermine its own security in its neighborhood and more broadly. So first one, that's that. Second is this question about economic interests, India's own economic interests. Now, the war occurred at a time where the Indian economy was growing. It's now in a pretty good place. It's now the 5th largest economy in the world, with room to grow even further. It has multiple economic interests in terms of trade, technology, investment, that it hopes to exploit through these through the divisions that now exist in the international system. So, for example, it requires more oil from Russia. It requires fertilizer, fruit from Russia. India is hoping to sell more missiles to countries like Egypt. It's hoping to sell space equipment to Argentina. India is now a much more important geoeconomic actor in the international system. And so what about the argument that those economic interests are affecting Indian foreign policy today more than ever? So that's the second one. The third is this question of status. As you were talking about it, I kept writing and I kept thinking, short of a seat within most international organizations at the global high table, how does a country like India, how does a rising power acquire status today? Does it do so by, because I think the international order is fragmenting, it's becoming messier. There are different forms of coalitions, networks emerging. I think countries are engaging and exploiting all these different patterns that are now, I think, that now increasingly characterize global governance today. So the nature of the international order in itself has changed. And I would assume the process in which countries also seek and acquire status will also change, right? India has created some institutions over the last 5 years. India's, for example, in the climate space, the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition on Disaster Relief and Infrastructure. It's playing a key role within several other minilateral organizations, Quad, I2U2, there are others. So how do rising powers acquire status in an international order that's fragmenting so rapidly? So I'll stop there and then maybe respond quickly to that, and then we can open up to more Q&A.
Sure. Thanks. Those are great questions. So on the interest thing, I mean, there's a number of responses to this. One is, I think, so that I can think of, I guess, 3 related responses. One is the interest ideas, the dichotomy is, in a sense, false. I mean, I think that the way we think about the world surely inflects the way we think about our interests. And so what is in our interest is ultimately a function of where we see ourselves in the world, right? And what our self-perceptions are. And so if we think that we are not being given our due, and by we, I mean humans, social groups, and so on, or if India thinks that it is not being given its due, that will inflect its understanding of its interests, right? So is it in India's interest to support the West is a fundamental question that is premised on whether the West will in the future turn on India or not, right? And that is a question that can only be answered by the ideas you hold about the West, because there's nothing that in the future that can, in the present, that can help you predict how the West is going to respond to your rise 20 years from now, right? India today is 5 times smaller than China, but in the future, and despite all the cooperation between India and the US, one can imagine a world in which India starts to demand more forcefully the things that it wants, and the US starts to push back more forcefully, and you end up in the same situation that the US and China are in today, but with the US and India 20 years from now, right? So in some sense, your interests are constructed by your self-perception, your idea, your identity, whatever, right? Another response, I think, is to say that, okay, even if you want to separate them out, they can exist together, right? Which is, it's possible for states to care both about their economic interest and their position in the social hierarchy of the international system. And then the question becomes, under what condition are they willing to sacrifice one over the other in particular scenarios, in particular situations, right? So then it's a question of, when there are moments in which there are extraordinary opportunities or threats to your position in the hierarchy or to your economic interests, you will give up some amount of status to achieve economic interest, or vice versa. You'll give up some amount of interest to achieve status, right? So that becomes an empirical question, but broadly we can assume and agree that states care about multiple things. Even humans care about multiple things. We don't just care about our paycheck, we also care about our job titles, right? We also care about how others are treated in our organization compared to us. Those are not incommensurate things. Third response, I think, would be to say, in some instances, one can identify those things that are driven by status that are against your interests, right? So where do the two predictions, in a sense, counteract or go in opposite directions? And I think the war presents an interesting case of that, which is the longer you support this war, the more expensive it is, as you pointed out, right? The economic stuff, which is fuel, fertilizer, and other commodities are getting sky high, supply chain issues, all of the things that, to move to your second question, all of the things that you said India cares about as an geo-economic actor, all those things would be much easier if there wasn't a massive war going on in the world, right? And so in a sense, the cost of business itself would be much lower. So it is actually in India's interest for this war to not happen, right? And so one could argue that India is acting against its own interest by not moving to end this war sooner. The question, of course, is why then? And so I think there's room again for both sides of that explanation to play a role. And the world is multi-causal and complex, despite the fact that I teach in a political science department. I will admit with historians that many things matter at once. It's not monocausal. And finally, I think, how does India acquire status in a fragmenting international? I think that's a great question, and it's perhaps the question for Indian foreign policy today to answer. You rightly pointed at the areas where India is exercising leadership, right? That's the sort of the way India frames it. But really, it's just India not putting a spoke in the wheels of international cooperation compared to what India used to do like decades ago. So, but the idea is, I think, what you see is India taking leadership in the areas where there is a little bit of a vacuum left by the US, right? The US pulls back from climate change, India steps in to fill that vacuum, organizes conferences of Pacific Island states and vulnerable states and so on. You see peacekeeping, where the West has traditionally not wanted to put their soldiers in harm's way, but they do pay the bills. India is happy to send its soldiers to do peacekeeping, right? So India does exercise leadership where it can, where the West has by intentionally or by default left space for India to actually act. I think that is exactly the way this thing is going to proceed, which is, as the order fragments, I think it's going to require very nimble diplomacy on India's part to identify those areas where it can achieve status, largely by providing quote unquote leadership to perhaps global South countries, right? Not the West, but to the global South. So in a sense, creating a different consideration, almost going back to Raja Mohan's idea, right? He sort of criticizes India in the Cold War for being the trade union leader of the global South, or trade union leader of the third world, right? Actually, being a trade union leader gives you a lot of bargaining leverage when you are negotiating with the higher ups, right? And you see that a little bit now. India is re-engaging with the global South a lot more because they've come to realize that there is political power there, right? And when the order is fragmenting, you want to shore up those resources and those alliances. I don't mean military alliances, those political alliances as the world fragments. I think that would be the way. Yeah.
Great. Let's go open it up for questions. I see Kanti is ready with a question, and then others, please identify yourselves after that. Yeah, Kanti.
Thanks, Ron. It sparked a lot of thoughts in my thinking about the issue. So I don't know how much I can come back on some of these points, but let me try with one in particular and see where it leads. I mean, the first point is, I mean, you began with this idea of India as a rising power and others wanting their due. But in fact, if you plot on an economic basis, India's proportion of world GDP, it's the same as it was roughly in 1960. So it's not rising economically relative to others much. The only major power that has risen massively since 1960 as a proportion of global GDP is China, but it's not India. Its proportion remains exactly the same, give or take. So one could say India is in fact not rising at all. And it's just a trope now that we're chucking out there based on growth rates and so on. But others are growing too, Indonesia and so many other countries. So we're left really globally in the same position. In that sense, there's no argument that we deserve this or we deserve that based on an economic reading of our rise. So I was thinking about then what is it that, is motivating this kind of concern? I really buy the idea that there's something about status and so on that's is really at work here. If you look at the February 4th statement, of 2022 between China and Russia. You just read that, there's nothing India would disagree with in that statement, the critique of the current order, basically, and of democracy and liberalism being thrust down everyone's throat. The only thing India wouldn't like in that statement is the critique by China and Russia of the Indo-Pacific. Otherwise, India's on board. So your point about them being very close to China and India being very close to China and Russia on the broad disposition towards world order seems to be, quite nicely captured by the statement which India would sign if there wasn't the Indo-Pacific statement. Do you think that what is the basis for India sort of feeling, it's not getting its due? Take the UN Security Council membership. Arguably, every one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council have supported India's some form of India's permanent membership in the UN Security Council, veto membership, but not quite full membership or full membership. Even the Chinese have said, that India is a country of growing importance, but it's probably the Chinese, not a Western country, that has opposed India's position in the UN Security Council. And it's mostly global South countries that oppose India's permanent veto membership. The various coalitions of middle powers and so on, who either want their continent or region better represented there, who actively oppose India, like Pakistan and so on and so forth. So it doesn't seem to me that it's the permanent members led by the West that's really opposing India in this regard. Do you think that, in fact, it's really this issue of civilizationalism, that India has this sense, along with maybe China and Russia, that we're a great civilization. Okay, so we don't qualify on an economic basis. We may not even qualify on a military basis. But we think of ourselves as one of the great foundational, as it were, civilizations of the world. And that's what we want. And I'm thinking a little bit of Partha Chatterjee, who a long time ago in his book on nationalism said that in arguing for freedom and all of that, and in respect of Western domination, Indian nationalists made a point about a splitting, basically saying, we don't have economic power, technological power, we don't have this, we don't, all those material elements, but we're a great spiritual civilization. That's what our contribution to the world is. And that's why we should be free. So if you extend that line of argument, I think a lot of this Indian angst is actually deep down about some sense that, rightly or wrongly, that we're a great civilization, one of the greatest of the world, and by God, why aren't we at the table as a result? So it's that more than anything else that seems to be really the driver of all of this. And in that sense, China and Russia are fellow travelers. They're also countries that feel they've never quite been given their due. China, the century of humiliation and all that kind of stuff. And Russia has a very ambivalent relationship to the West historically, particularly Western Europe and so on. And they lost the Cold War, as it were. So there's that chip on the shoulder there. And we have our own chip on the shoulder by colonialism. And there's this kind of boiling resentment that the most powerful don't recognize our civilization as being something very valuable and preeminent. And that's what it really is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, long statement.
Anit, sorry. Actually, no.
It's following up.
Sorry, just following up, I would like to ask perhaps the same question in different words, which is how do Indian foreign policy leaders justify their quest for status, given that they are not equal? So why should they be treated like equal? How do they tell the stories to themselves, or how do they tell the story when they are asking for equal status, when it's clear from any possible point of view that there is no equality in the relationship? Or again, in still other words, how, if India was, a permanent member of the Security Council, it had, the status it's seeking, how would India look at another country having exactly the same features of India, requesting a spot at the table? Would they see it as, justifiable or not?
Anit. Thank you, Diego. Great presentation, Rowan. I wasn't sleeping. I was just astounded by
Resting your eyes.
question.
Yeah.
No, so a couple of thoughts on this, and it's a thought-provoking talk. Firstly, I'm intrigued by the fact that
there is no serious opposition in India that questions India's foreign policy on Ukraine. And as you showed in your slide, among the Indian people, there's almost a sneaking sympathy of Russia, right? So the question is, where is status explaining how the Indian people feel about Russia, right? Is that actually, as you say, is that a long shadow of India-Russia cooperation, or is that showing an anti-Western sentiment among the Indian people or the Indian elite? So that's one basket of questions. So do you think if India got the status, the Indian people will start feeling differently about the West, right? I mean, however you are defining status. Secondly is, even if we were to imagine India get into this table that you speak about, right, in any shape or form that you think of, do you think that would have changed India's response to the exact circumstances of the Ukraine war? Because I'm not convinced that it would. That even if India was a part of the United Nations Security Council, it'll either duck the difficult question by abstaining, or not come out clearly allying itself with the West, and instead take on the trade union Baji, I mean, as you suggested, and say, wait a second. So if I could ask you about that too. Thank you.
So maybe we'll just stop there and then we'll come back for another round when you're done.
Yeah, no, great. Okay. So is India rising? Can I share one thing? Sorry, just Yusuf, is that okay? I'm just going to share it from here. And like any good graduate student, I have some backup slides. Where is it? This was sorry, this was something that I did for my book, which was because I was looking at the US, Japan, and India. So something I do in the book is essentially open up what we mean by rising, right? Because we in the literature we tend to think of rising powers as those that have already risen up to a point and are now in a position to challenge the international order. But rising is a decades-long process. It happens over long periods of time. And so, in a sense, when states are rising, relatively speaking, this is true of India as well, right? If you just this is a moving average of GDP growth rate plotted over time from 1820 to 1988, and it looks at the three cases in my book: the US, Japan, and India. And they're broadly within the same bracket, right? So if we think of the US as a rising power in the 19th century, which it was, India itself is also. So then it becomes a question of if rising is a relative concept, is it relative to others, or is it relative to your past performance, right? In the sense, year-on-year GDP growth rate is one thing versus rising relative to China, right? No one would come off looking good on that, right? And the reason, in a way, that India stays at that 2.8 or 3.3, depends, it goes up, right? Up and down, is precisely because the denominator is changing because of China, right? So India is still, relative to its past, growing quite substantially. It's just that relative to China, it's not. And so the claim that I make in the book is that when you yourself are experiencing a substantial growth over a sustained period of time, subject to a minimum, so I'm not looking at like Switzerland growing fast, because I'm saying large countries that grow fast or grow sustainably, not fast, grow sustained over a period of time, they develop a certain sense of self-importance, right? Now, where that self-importance comes from is also the second part of your question, which is, I think, key. I can stop sharing this now just to put the focus back on. Yeah. So in a sense, so this is a little bit of like thinking about the causality, right? Which is, does rise produce a sense of civilizationism, or does civilizationism, in a sense, produce your rise or your feeling that you deserve something, right? It's really hard to disentangle that because historically, if you think about the sort of English school idea of the standard of civilization, which great power has not had it, right? The Europeans believed that they were the most civilized of the entire world. The Americans then thought that they are greater than the Europeans. They were the great nation of futurity, as they said, with Manifest Destiny and all of that stuff in the mid-19th century. They thought they were even better than the Europeans because they represented Republican liberalism, small r Republican liberalism. Then you have Japan coming on the scene, who also think they're a great civilization. Then you have China, you have the Soviets, Russia, India. So in a sense, Turkey today, there are many countries, right? And Isaiah Berlin had this great article in the 70s about nationalism, which ties into civilizationism, right? And he argued that the reason we see Germany and Italy taking on the European order in the First World War is because they were excluded from the core of what it meant to be European, right? They were late formers, 1871, 1880s, and they were kind of excluded by the British and the French from that consideration of of equality, right? And they were not given equal consideration, which is why they were, the Italians saw themselves as have-not powers, right, in the run-up to the First World War. So for me, civilizationism is a narrative or a rhetoric or a repository of a repertoire of like devices you can bring out to make your case for status, right? Which is that we are a great civilization, therefore we deserve this. But the drive for status does, I think, at least a lot of psychological studies show, when your material circumstances are improving, you feel like you deserve more eminence among your peers. And who your peers are also starts to change, right? So a lot of the work in this area is kind of abstracting up from group level studies among humans, right? Assuming that leaders are constructed the same way. So yeah, so I don't know if civilizationism is a separate metaphysical ontological thing. I think it is a function of rising, right? And everyone, and many, all great powers, I'd say, have a sense of civilizational greatness. Then how do we distinguish between that? And what causes variation in that is also a question, right? So Manjari's new book on narratives talks about it, but she doesn't tell us where narratives come from. She just assumes that some countries have narratives and others don't, right? So I think it's an area that we should think about more. So Diego's question, how do Indian leaders justify their quest for equality when they're not equal? Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think they're looking for symbolic equality. They're not looking for, they know they don't have material equality, but they feel like they deserve something based on greatness, right? Future greatness. It's this idea that we're growing, we're going to be important in the future, therefore we're going to be a great part in the future, and therefore we should be recognized for that today, right? In about a decade ago, I wrote an article on India's approach to UN Security Council reform, and we interviewed a number of sort of elites, right, on this question. And many of them were like, oh, India doesn't have to fight for Security Council reform. It will just happen. The doors will open for India, right? And that is in a way how the Americans were thinking about themselves in the early 19th century, right? So there is a sense in which you're destined for greatness, and it will come. Of course, I think that was back then. Now there's, I think, much more friction in the international order, and India does talk a lot more about reformed multilateralism than it did back then, although the desire for Security Council reform has been consistent for decades, even going back to Narasimha Rao and that period. Anit and Diego's question is kind of related a little bit. If India had UN Security Council membership, would it either look, how would it look on new admits to the Security Council, and how would it respond to the war in Ukraine? Yeah, so I think giving status or attaining status does change your view on the order. And it's hard to predict what would happen because we haven't had a new country join the Security Council in a long time. But 1971 China, right? China starts to today, the Security Council is one of China's most prized institutions. They see it as the most legitimate and most representative body in the international order, precisely because they get the most status in that organization. And they're often willing to go along with peacekeeping operations and things that are actually against their interests in the Middle East, because they don't want to be seen as a irresponsible actor in the body that they hold to be quite high status, right? The example with India is, I think, the nuclear deal, right? After decades and decades of exclusion from the international nuclear order, the US essentially says, let's strike a deal. India is now a de facto responsible nuclear power. And you see how India's position changes on a host of nuclear issues, right? With regard to proliferation and all. India is no longer, if it weren't for the clause in the NPT that said, if you didn't have nuclear weapons on January 1st, 1967, you're never a nuclear power, India would have signed the NPT. That's the only thing standing in the way, right? That itself tells you about status in some sense, that there's an official bar to doing that. But otherwise, India has been fairly cooperative on the international nuclear order, even voting against Iran in the UN Security Council and stuff like that, right? So attaining status does make you feel more invested in that order and make you act in a more cooperative way. So I think again, I'm not arguing in absolutes. I'm not saying India would suddenly become a pro-Ukraine, like Singapore light up their consulate in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. No, it would be a more tempered approach. I think there would be things that India could do and say that, look, this is not a good thing for broader economic and political stability in the world. They're not saying anything right now, right? Because they don't feel like this is theirs to protect. They can still benefit and leverage the current system, right? And so on admitting new members, that's a great question. I mean, I think this idea of closing the door behind you is really strong, right? Once you're in the Security Council, you don't want more people to join, because status is a positional good. If everyone has it, no one has it, right? If we're all privileged actors, then no one is privileged. And so in that sense, yeah, there's an incentive to keep it small. And so India would 100% try to shut the door on others after that, right? There's no doubt about it. Because in all of this, I'm not saying that India is advocating for anybody else. It's only advocating for itself. India is, in that sense, not a trade union leader of the third world anymore. It is an advocate for its own inclusion. And that's how I sort of think about the historical stuff as well. Does status explain how Indians feel about Russia? Yeah, so this is another very important question, which is India's feelings about Russia and India's feelings about international order. There's a tendency to conflate those two things. I think there is a core of sympathy with Russia, although it is inflected with India's resentment of the West, right? So they are seen as, in a sense, brothers in political arms against the West, that we will stand together, create a multipolar order where the West can shove it, essentially, right? Because they've given us terrible treatment for all these years. And they are the ones who, so in a sense, again, going back to that interests versus ideas debate or dichotomy, our position in a group's position in the international order structures how they perceive other actors, right? And I think India perceives Russia as a useful and a sympathetic actor in countering the hegemony of the West. So then the question is, if India was in the club, would it? So again, it goes back to the idea that I think they would be more critical of Russia, but they perhaps would still trade with Russia. As does Japan. Japan's doing the same thing. They're not pulling out necessarily. I mean, the US is still buying uranium rods from Russia, by the way, right? The US is also not fully cut off its trade ties from Russia, because you cannot, at some level, there is a hard floor of economics that you cannot overcome. So again, I'm trying to just make a more nuanced argument to say that more things than just economics matter.
Yep. Sorry, just one. Mike.
Hi, Rowan. Excellent presentation. So I had a couple of questions. One was, since you talked about the normative component or lack thereof, as India and China rise. So I mean, if you were to do some kind of crystal ball gazing in terms of the future of the international order, and if it, if you assume that there's going to be a secular rise of India and China, do you think that it is going in a direction where we might have an international order without a kind of a hegemonic ideal, a hegemonic normative order in that sense?
That is the question. What is about India's stance in terms of its domestic politics? In terms of does India's stance also reflect the current government's will to use foreign policy as a tool of domestic policy mobilization?
Ronojoy?
Related to this usually in the Indian foreign policy takes the idea of literally this knowledge and the beginning and thinking of, is there some sort of serious thinking through of this idea and guide again to civilization and
And Sandeep?
Sorry. Found this very convincing. It was a very interesting talk, and a big fan of your book anyway, right? Like we talked about it. But because you opened door to multi-causal explanations, having all sorts of conversation. A couple of thoughts. One is what Anit said, and I think is a very important thing, right? Like that there is a considerable sympathy in the Indian strategic community about this particular case, right? Like even if you see Shiv Shankar Menon's book or Shyam Saran's conversation about this, that there is an understanding and a Russian way of thinking about what went down, like how this conflict came about, right? Like that where the war blame lies, right? Like for this thing, and there is a considerable amount of sympathy for that perspective, which leads me to thinking about flipping the question, right? Like you asked the question, the puzzle being that why doesn't India condemn Russia? If you flip the puzzle as why would India condemn Russia? Like why would it care, right? There is aside from the economic instability and all those factors, there's a basic logic with which Western position is determined here, right? Like which is that there's a security concern, there's an understanding that post-Cold War borders in Europe should not be changed and challenged, right? Like Russian expansion is a direct threat to security and challenges international order. India doesn't care about those things. and doesn't see itself in a role where it thinks about that it is its job to uphold international order, right? There's a way of thinking about it, that we are just a $3 trillion economy, and that Shankar statement. So then the puzzle becomes very different, right? What would bring India to actually step in with the West rather than asking the question that why doesn't condemn Russia? And the second thought around that is anybody actually really, I mean, this is perhaps putting it too strongly, but is anybody in the world really wants India to take a position here? Perhaps there is a role to be played as a neutral player in the world, right? Like, is the world really polarized to a degree where everybody is being asked to be either this side or that side? Because, for example, one of the key roles that India is playing is import all the Russian oil, which is keeping the Russian price stable, right? Like the oil prices, global oil prices stable. And that is something that the Americans have sort of allowed and look the other way for that to happen. Otherwise, there are a lot of mechanisms in terms of global insurance and shipping and banking by which Western sanctions can be turned into global sanctions. But in this particular case, they are not being turned in, right? Like, because there was a time in Cold War, for example, when everybody was asked to either join one side or the other, and there was very limited side for neutrals to exist. But in this particular case, it seems like there is a certain tolerance in the system for neutrals to exist and also in some way support the strange shell game that is going on in the world, right? Like, of keeping it all going. So what do you think about that?
One last question, and then, sorry. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So I have one question. So I just wanted to know, can status seeking behavior explain, say, when it comes to our own backyard, India is like, India doesn't allow multilateral intervention, be it in Sri Lanka or others. But when it comes to a conflict that are far-flung, we call for like multilateral intervention. So can this divergence in India's stance when it comes to its own backyard and when it comes to far-flung areas be explained through status-seeking behavior? Thank you.
Okay, and can you just keep it very quick? One last point, and then we'll go back to it.
I just wanted to add Dr. Jalka and Prof. Haneet's question. I'll keep it short. It's regarding the domestic again. I'm really sorry. In your sort of research, have you found any evidence to support the fact that India's contrarian position may be used as a way to manufacture affective nationalism and sort of black box domestic opposition? That's
great. Very easy question to interrupt with.
Yes. Okay. Right. Okay. So can you have order without a hegemonic project, right? Amit's question. I think it's a really, we're so used to thinking about order through a particular Western lens that we think of it as being hinged on a set of overarching principles. This is the sort of Eikenberry gloss on history, right? Which is the Americans had a certain idea and they propagated it through order. I think that's not inaccurate. I just worry that we can't really extend it further back, because he starts in the British period, like the Atlantic system, British hegemony. The British were largely a commercial empire. They were not a political, in the sense they started off as a commercial empire that evolved into a political empire. The US always started as a political empire in some sense. And we see with China today starting as a commercial empire, BRI and all of that, which will evolve into a political empire. So in a sense, so the question then becomes, what did Britain's political empire really stand for? It was still largely mercantilist, right? So it's possible to have international order without these overarching nice things like liberalism and open whatever it is. And the thing is, the US doesn't often follow its own principles, right? You pick most areas of the present international order, they have not actually signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the International Criminal Court Rome Statute, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. There is a host of things where it's one set of rules for the United States and another set of rules for others, right? So it is still the exercise of power and privilege ultimately that drives it. It's also the case that economic dominance today rests much more on finance than on trade. And so the US also has mercantilist benefits in that sense. So yeah, all this to say that I don't buy the idea that order must have values underpinning it. It can also be a purely transactional mercantilist order. And I think that's what China's kind of pushing towards, right? a lot of course, what China and India and Russia do is just, and this is where they don't have normative positions. It's more in opposition to the West. It's like not West equals what we want, right? But that doesn't have any content yet, but I think they will find their way as they're going forward. On the domestic political point, to link your question as well, does the stance reflect foreign policy as a tool of domestic political mobilization or manufacturing nationalism, affective nationalism? Absolutely, I think it works, right? I think there's a view that says, oh, this is driven by nationalism. I actually don't think that's true. I think the elite queuing theory of public opinion is much more convincing, which is elites can actually shape public opinion in a certain way, not to the extent of manufacturing consent, but at least to shape the information environment in which the public forms its opinions, right? So then the question is, a lot of it hinges on how much the Indian voter votes on foreign policy issues, and I don't think they do, right? I mean, I think people like Milan Vaishnav and others have shown that the voting behavior is much more driven by localized concerns over caste and ethnicity and economics to a certain extent, domestic economics, right? But does it help to crush the opposition? Again, I mean, it's unclear that the opposition would take a very different stance on this particular issue. So I think, or in many areas, notwithstanding the kind of things that Rahul Gandhi says about China, which seem very poorly informed, but in general, I think the opposition is smart enough to not, and this really builds on the fact that Modi is ultimately building on the base of like Congress policies. This is not something that we woke up in 2014 to develop a new foreign policy. Strategic autonomy is a continuation exactly of what has been India's policy. In the Cold War, non-alignment was inflected with post-colonial ideology. Now it is much more transactional interest-based, but it is ultimately the same thing. It's a route to multipolarity and great power status for India. That's all it is, right? And so in that sense, there is not much disagreement among the political classes on this particular question. And that is, you can see that by going back to when the Congress was in power and they had the same ideas, right? Maybe the current regime is pursuing it with more vigor because they have fewer domestic opponents, but this narrative doesn't help them in any way crush those opponents. They are doing themselves, in a way, doing that. So yeah, Ronojoy's question on Vishwaguru, is it just symbolic? Like I said, yes, but symbolism is everything. Like for me, like in the symbolic politics of status is exactly what it is, right? These are not material politics per se. They have material consequences, but symbols matter a lot. And so I think that India does take that stuff. Again, it's like, you know the value of it in a strategic sense, but you also believe that symbolic power is important to have, right? Now, do you really believe that India can become a Vishwaguru? I mean, when I say you, the leadership, can they really believe that? Or are they cynically using this in some way? As long as it works, it almost doesn't matter, right? So if you think about Nehru's sort of non-alignment and other internationalist principles, India is now offering more particularist principles that are tied to India rather than being sort of global South-y in that way. But whether they believe them or not, it's almost impossible to know, first of all. And secondly, it doesn't matter as long as it works. It's a very unsatisfying answer, but the symbolism does matter, right? Sandeep's question. So why would India condemn Russia, right? In a sense, yeah. So Shiv Shankar Menon in 2014 famously said, that Russia and Ukraine both have legitimate interests in Crimea, right? That people have forgotten, right? But they said that, which is much more than what the current regime has said, by the way. The current regime has not come out so openly. And so then in that sense, there is continuity across regimes as well. And so why would India condemn Russia? I think there's some reasons here. I think one is the weakening of international norms, right? Norms that there should be agreement around in the future when if China tries to perhaps too excessively approach India's territorial claims or the border issue, right? You want those norms to be strong enough and there not to be this precedent of violation and then no one says anything, right? Or people don't act. That's the normative. You're weakening a norm over time if you don't do anything to support it. But the other part of it is self-interested, which is why Singapore is supporting the sanctions and support, which is international law. There will be a tit for tat kind of phenomenon, which is, and you see this already in the West, right? Which is people are saying, oh, well, since India has not supported us, why would we support them in the future if they have any kind of problem with China, right? Now, you could argue that India can manage its own affairs and does not need the support of the West, but all else being equal, it does help, right? And so there is also a self-interested reason to perhaps condemn, right? Or at least try to seek a reversion to the status quo or a settlement or something, right? Nothing has happened on that front. And again, of course, privately, I'm sure there are many conversations and dissatisfactions, but public articulation does matter. What would convince India to step in with the West? And I think that's a great question. The one thing that does not work and will not work is the continuous harping on foundational principles of international order, the rules-based order, sovereignty, territorial integrity. As you say, India doesn't care about any of those things, right? I think what would help India is a focus on the costs of the war. And this is true of all global South countries that are deeply hurting right now with the global inflation that the war has unleashed, right? And so the Western message was to change, to focus much less on why is our international order being destroyed, to this is really costly for a lot of actors around the world, and let's do something about solving this economic problem, which is ultimately really the domestic political concern of many governments in the global South. That would be a much more receptive, that would find a much more receptive audience in India, to say that for economic prosperity and stability, let's try and end this war. But the West is not saying that. They're actually putting more and more economic constraints, as you said, through the global banking system and making it very difficult for many actors to actually function, right? And then if you add to that the US-China stuff around de-risking, decoupling, and the higher costs of all of that, in general, the net welfare losses in the global economy are really ballooning at this point, right? So it's more and more costly for countries to kind of participate in that. Does anyone want India to take a position? Yes, I think the West does, right? This is something that, again, I hate to be that person who's like, I spoke to somebody, but like in various occasions when I've had the opportunity to speak to policy people who are involved in policymaking in these Western capitals and in Japan, there is this like private seething against India. They're upset. They'll never say it publicly, but they're disappointed, they're upset, they're angry that India is not coming along with the West, right? Why? And why are we giving India so many things if they're not even going to say anything about the war in Ukraine, right? And of course, then there's the other side. It's always a debate. The other side says, well, we don't need them to say anything. Actually, if India is just India, that also helps in some sense. Right? So that's where the oil stuff comes in there, because they're buying, it keeps the price stable. That was a little bit of post hoc rationalization. I think the Americans were looking for a silver lining and the Biden administration settled on that. But otherwise, politically, the optics are not great. And the West does, they're all basically taking note. And then does this affect their position on future territorial or sovereignty disputes that India has with other actors? Probably. Does it matter for Indian foreign policy? That's an open question, right? Right now, India is the belle of the ball. Everybody wants to quote India because China is the greatest threat in Asia. So India is going to get away with a lot. And this is one of the things that India gets away with. Far as India's calls for multilateral intervention in far-flung areas, I actually don't think they do. If you look at India's record in the UN and the UN Security Council since the end of the Cold War, they have been consistently opposed to multilateral intervention, that particularly of Chapter 7 multilateral intervention, which is non-consensual, right? Without the consent of the target state, India is very wary of those, and so is China, although China has gone along much more because it is already in the club and therefore sees its position as a responsible actor, right? India has nothing to lose, and so they don't want to be part of these things that can slide into regime change, right? So, right, going back to Hardeep Singh Puri's time as UN Perm Rep to the UN, India has opposed all this, and even before that, right? So they're willing to send they're willing to contribute troops to peacekeeping, but the violation of state sovereignty is still a no-go zone for India, right? Particularly when it's done outside the remit of the UN, like the Iraq War and so on. Therefore, I think that it is still in line with sort of not having intervention in its own neighborhood as well. Although, I mean, during the Cold War, India did intervene. I mean, the Bangladesh War, the IPKF, the Maldives coup of 1988, India intervened much more when it was a weaker power than it does today when it's quite capable of intervening. And that's also an interesting puzzle, right? I'm working on a paper on that, and I think it also has to do with how the global consensus has shifted. Intervention itself, or rather, the West became much more interventionist after the Cold War. There was a massive rise in multilateral interventions to the UN, pushed by the US and France and other actors. And India and China observe that and move in the opposite direction. They are much more interventionist in the Cold War. They become much less so because the meaning of intervention itself changes after the Cold War. So, yeah.
We have shot over time, but I'm sure all of us are happy to be here for that. This started off as a talk on India and the war in Ukraine, but it delved into many, many areas, including Indian foreign policy, Indian politics, geoeconomics, and the nature of international order, and so much more. And that's a testament to your ongoing and fast work, Rowan. Thank you so much for the talk, for being here at ISAS for a couple of weeks, and for giving us enough reasons to go and buy your book, which is Ascending Order, Rising Powers, and the Politics of Status in International Institutions. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.